Now, our next speaker has been helping brands launch and grow communities for more than 2 decades. John has worked with hundreds of enterprise communities, and today at Gainsight, he partners with customers to design full scale community strategies that deliver measurable ROI. In this session, John will take on one of the toughest challenges we face, proving community value. He will share a practical framework that moves beyond chasing individual data points and instead tells the bigger story of how community drives retention, expansion, advocacy, and more, all while keeping members at the heart of it. Please join me in welcoming John Wishart. Hello, John.
Hi, Beth. Thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it.
Love to have you.
Excellent. All right. Well, let me get my presentation up on the screen here. We should be on our way. There we go.
Great.
Beautiful. So I appreciate everyone taking the time this afternoon, or wherever it might be for you, for spending some time with me to talk through how to prove out value, and maybe more specifically, how to move from individual metrics and instead frame up value through the lens of shared outcomes. I'm going to start off my presentation the best way I know how, which is with an obnoxious semantics argument. I'm very purposefully selecting the term value over the course of our conversation here in lieu of ROI for a reason that I hope becomes clear as we progress forward. ROI is a really critically important measure, but it is ultimately a lopsided measure. It is ultimately an investment outcome. Did the money or time we put into this initiative yield a return on the other side? What I hope to talk through with you all today and field questions around throughout the conversation is how to continue telling that story, but as a byproduct of value and benefit that we are able to bring to our community members. Now, I've got an audience that is deeply receptive to that conversation. I'm preaching to the converted, as it were. But what I hope to be able to step through is what are some practical frameworks through which we can actually have that conversation. And to start with, I'm going to kind of lead off with arguably the least controversial statement in the conversation here today, which is that value is reciprocal, particularly in the space of community. We must first deliver value to our customers, to our members, in order to deliver value to our organizations, to our business, wherever we might be focused on our community initiative. Now, that's probably relatively straightforward, again, non-controversial. What is true, however, and I think what is such a temptation for community teams and community professionals is tackling the problem backwards. We know that we want to get to the point to be able to have this conversation about reciprocal benefit. We sort of reverse engineer our way there. I want to talk through how we can think about flipping that, starting with our members first and working our way up towards value rather than the reverse. In order to do so, I want to kind of step through something that probably sounds familiar, is often the genesis of community initiatives, which is you get a problem statement from an organization. We need to cross-sell our products to grow revenue. Our support model is not going to scale. We don't have enough product advocates. Our churn's too high. We have low product adoption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? We've all been given these challenges. And I think the temptation is to then say, okay, community is indeed a viable solution to that problem. But if we tackle it through that lens without building the case through the members' benefit, why their investment of time, energy is worthwhile, we create an environment that ultimately feels lopsided. Imagine going to a community that says, welcome to our brand community. We're here to sell you more stuff. We're here to try and minimize the number of times that you talk to our support staff. It's pretty transparently transactional at that point. And so what I would like to be able to do over our conversation here is introduce a couple of different frameworks that we find to be successful at introducing community value as an outcome of member value. So what I'd like to do then is start with a framework that I find to be particularly impactful at thinking through what is a prototypical archetypal customer journey when it comes to leveraging and using a community experience. Now, I should caveat, this is a framework. By definition, frameworks are an attempt to remove nuance, specificity, and create something broadly applicable. So I recognize that you all are going to be in circumstances where you say, we're actually starting, in the middle, we're starting at the end. Reality exists, and we have to recognize that it will intervene in the best laid plans, and that frameworks serve as a guide for thinking, not a dictatorial process that we need to feel that we have to adhere to. But nonetheless, I find this framing of community users' journey through community really valuable. And that's through the lens of 3 primary questions that they are answering at different phases of their journey. The first of which is what I will call the how do I flavor of community. Someone that comes to community with a self-centered, and I do not mean that pejoratively, but a self-centered need. How do I get my product to do what I need it to do? How do I get this obnoxious error message to go away? How do I turn on the capability? How do I? Right? It's this desire on the part of the community member to receive an answer. It is a self-centered orientation to community. It's valuable nonetheless, right? We have an opportunity genuinely to address that need, get someone the response that they require in order to move them to what I would call the how do you form of community. Once I understand how to overcome a particular obstacle, my conception of the possibility space increases. I now know or have an interest in asking, well, now that I've accomplished my task, how do you, peer, friend, community member, how do you solve a similar problem? How do you use tooling in a way that maybe is different than the way that I'm using the tool? How do you conduct integrations? Whatever the question might be. The sense and frame of reference evolves as we continue to move across that journey. It shifts to what can I learn from another community member rather than transactionally, what can they give me? Subtle shift, but it's an important one, and we'll talk about its influence on measurement as we continue forward. That then unlocks us a conversation style that I'll call what if we? What if we collaboratively did something new, extended the use of a particular product? What if we made the case to change a feature? What if we collaborated and wrote some guides? It's community where it is genuinely collaborative rather than community through the form of how do you? It's then a collective. Now, this feels fuzzy and ethereal, I recognize, but where this becomes important is as we start to then think through how do we construct a measurement framework that recognizes the reality that your internal stakeholders want to get to the point very quickly, right? They want to know, what is this doing for me, for us as an organization, but still allow you to tell the story of what it is doing for your community membership. So what I'd like to do is step through a 3-level framework that Erica Kuhl introduced at Gainsight a couple weeks back as a way of thinking through aligning a couple of different measurement levers. And I want to start with activity metrics, the one we all know, love, and arguably hate, but nonetheless have to rely on for an important reason. These are the measures that allow you to talk about core community member usage of your environment. They give you a sense of, I'd argue, outright viability. Are we getting signs that community members are finding utility and output from the time that they are spending with us? This is going to really run the gamut of a lot of different forms of activity metrics. You're going to be thinking about core measures that you will find familiar that most platforms will provide you access to around how many monthly active users do I have? How many visits, return visits, posts, replies, new registrations? The list goes on and on and on of things that you can count that are occurring within the context of your community. Now, I think there has been arguably an overcorrection in our measurement processes over the last number of years, where we have recognized these measures are ultimately insufficient at telling the holistic story of community's impact, but they are nonetheless essential. They are that core viability measure. If we go back to our how do I, how do you, how do we framework, it starts to give us a sense of, is there even latent interest in this environment? Do we see people coming through the digital front door, as it were, of our community with respect to visits and visitors? Do we see engagement in content creation by way of posts and content construction? It's that core level of measurement that we want to ensure we are constantly reporting up, but being selective about which of those things we tell a story around. Now, the next layer of value, I think, is the one that we want to spend arguably the most time over the course of our conversation today, at least, on, and that is departmental impact metrics that start to then marry the story around what is happening that is benefiting our community members, how are they leveraging our environment, and what impact is it providing back to my reporting line, as it were, to my core immediate stakeholders. There are going to be a lot of measures here that we could potentially include in this framework. I've got a sampling of them. You almost certainly have additional ones that are not included on the slide here. But this is really thinking about what are those metrics that are going to be aligned clearly to the organization and department that I roll up through. If I'm in marketing, it might be leads generated. If I'm in CS, it might be NPS. It might be support ticket deflection. It could be product insights. It's effectively what is the output that I want to be able to go back to my peers and tell them the impact story around. So how does this actually start to manifest with one another? We'll take a look at just a very, very broad example before looking at one of the formulas that we can think through as an option here of what these two look like stacked. What does it look like to report out level 1? What does it look like to then marry that up with level 2? So if we think about some of the level 1 measures, reading from left to right, we've got a community that, let's call this a 3-month span, has generated 4,000 questions that each have been answered. 83% of those are peer-driven responses. That all represents 100% rate of growth year over year. Great, right? That tells me a lot in and of itself. It tells me that there is indeed interest in my environment, that there is efficacy and partnership with other community members by virtue of the fact that 83% of responses are from peers and that it's growing. That is a core part of my message, but it is insufficient without then jumping forward to the next component for my internal conversation, which is, and that success is providing us with $2 million of monthly support savings. Large number, I recognize. But so these two things must and inherently work in concert with one another. Imagine a scenario where either of these things are prevented singularly in isolation from the other level. If I've got just my top level metrics, what's the outcome that I should care about? How do I make determinations about additional investment, funding, resources, all of those things? Legitimate questions. The flip, the inverse is also true. If I had a reporting process internally that simply said, we're saving $2 million a month in support savings cost, I would very justifiably likely get a lot of questions. Well, what is that coming from? How are we arriving at that determination? I need to have that activity level metric to start to build my story to what is the shared outcome that we are providing for community members. Now, I'd like to look at one example formula of how this can be done. Now, I recognize this is a formula many of you may have seen. It's one that is been used in community circles for a good long while. It's a survey methodology that looks at support deflection costs. There are a lot of valid criticisms of the model that I'll address in a moment, hopefully. But I wanted to use this as a jumping off point for the conversation to highlight a way in which we can get to these departmental impact metrics. I won't spill whatever the digital equivalent of spilling too much ink, like what would the verbal, expel too much air on this topic of like, how do we start to pick apart the inadequacies and insufficiencies of some of these models? Again, it's a model. It's a framework by which we can adapt, customize, and tailor to our unique circumstances. And I find this model provides ongoing utility. The approach is such. We take the number of people that are visiting our environment, and then via a survey, we have asked, what were you here for? We take the percentage of folks that indicate I was here because I needed some assistance of some kind. I was here for the how do I's. We then take into consideration the resolved percentage. What percentage of respondents said, found what I was looking for, thank you so much. And then critically, we ask the hypothetical, if you had not found your response, what would you have done next question. Winnow down our first starting spot of number of unique visitors down to the number of folks that we believe were here for support, found an answer, and did not have a need to contact support, which they had a predisposition to do. We take that number and we can then multiply it by the average cost per contact into a support organization. Now, the criticisms that exist of this model, I do not want to just lampshade them, and by virtue of saying that there are criticisms, we are escaped and excused from them. There are a lot of legitimate needs to tailor this number to an organization. I'll highlight a couple just as an example and representation of what this tailoring process requires. It might be entirely true for your organization that the starting input may not be the overall number of unique visitors to your environment. It could be a subsection to specific dedicated areas that you believe to be contributing to support in this example. It could very well be you need to take a pass at the number that recognizes some of us work for enterprise organizations that don't allow anyone to submit a support ticket, right? It was a contractual obligation. So there might be some community users who could never submit a ticket. So we don't want to overstate on that front. It could be that a weighted average cost is insufficient for your organization, and it wildly varies. So certain issues cost a certain amount, others are wildly more expensive because they require engineering time, all totally valid. The core point here being we need to have an approach that allows us to go from, I'm going to jump backwards one slide. It's such a bad habit, I apologize. But we need to have an approach that allows us to talk about both of these layers, that allows us to say, this is where we believe our impact to be generated, given what we see above. Now, what I hope to be the component of our conversation here today to be a little bit different is that our belief is that also those department impact metrics are still ultimately insufficient at telling the entirety of the story around the value that community has created. I'm going to continue picking on that support deflection example. If the output that I was focused on exclusively and entirely was support deflection, I actually have a much more effective approach than community for support deflection. It's a, hey, we don't field support tickets. We're not going to answer anything, right? If you've got a question, tough, pal. Like that would be the outcome that I could most optimize for. But we recognize that to be a ridiculous premise, right? That deflection is ultimately an input into a broader strategic business outcome, something that marries up and creates an easy laddering mechanism from your department focus to something broader, more important to both the business and your community members. What could that look like? Those could be things like improved and increased product adoption. It could be mitigation of churn. It could be improvement to revenue, cross-sell. All of those things are long tail strategic business outcomes that can be generated from effective community experiences. But they take a lot of time to be able to measure our way towards, which is one of the closing points I want to make. A couple more points after this is this does cascade over the course of time. We can start to measure those core activity metrics very, very quickly. Near immediately, we know how many people are showing up, how much content is being created. We need a quarter or two to be able to start to tell the story around, well, how is that baseline activity generating departmental impact of some sort? And then we need generally a year-ish of time to be able to say, and how is that support deflection, empowerment of self-service, product insights, how are those impacting retention and churn? Think about broad business relationships. Very often contracts are 1, 2, 3 years, multiple years often. To be able to tell a story about churn, time must pass definitionally. And so we want to make sure that we are setting expectations accordingly and building a framework and story that allows us to tell that across the broad scope of our community's existence. And so how do we then start to take all of this quantitative input and start to bring that data to life to tell a shared outcome story? Now, in transparency, shocking, I know I work for Gainsight. So my example is based off of a Gainsight product suite. But you can imagine a scenario in which one of our customers would be joining together their community activity, their SkillJar customer education activity, and their customer success platform activity. I need to get profile information, engagement activity, all of the rich, robust data points that are coming out of community tooling. The same is true regardless of whatever platform you may be using for your community initiative. What are the things that the tool provides for you? And from there, I must join it with other data that I have within my organization. CRM platform is an extremely common one. How can I determine from my community activity what account activity looks like, what opportunity data there might be, what renewal status is? For the deflection example that we talked about, you might also be joining your survey platform data with that output. The core idea here being we must take multiple different data sources, join them together in order to tell an actual story of some kind, right? One that goes past, here's a readout of a bunch of numbers. And to that end, I would like to tell a story of one of the customers that we work with. This is Airtable. I recognize I should caveat, I am telling someone else's story. That always feels very, very awkward. All credit for the output of this belongs to Kevin Dunn and his team over at Airtable. I simply have the benefit of talking about all of their hard work. But what Airtable has done is brought together their education experience with their community experience. They've built an infrastructure that's got content that is shared between the various tools, templates that are consistent across the experience, and weaved it throughout their onboarding loop so that when a new customer is onboarding into Airtable, they are introduced to community. They have training that is constantly reinforcing new capabilities, tooling, and they are conducting a listening program throughout the experience that says these are repeated issues that come up time and time again that we need to build content around, whether that's community content, training content, etc. So that's kind of the state of play, as it were, within Airtable. But the output is really incredible. And I think this is a fundamental representation of that three-tiered hierarchy that we've stepped through. Level one, what have they seen in terms of usage? 100,000 community members, 75,000 courses that have seen enrollments in. What's the departmental impact? 67% of those enrollments have gone through completion. What's the level 3 strategic business outcome? It's an improvement of 15% in retention from folks that are leveraging these experiences. They've hit it all very, very quickly. We've got 100,000 folks, 75,000 courses, nearly or a little bit over 2/3 of them are being completed, which is generating for us a 15% retention impact. Clear, crisp, concise story that hits each of those levels: activity metrics, departmental impact, strategic business outcomes. What I would layer on top of that is it also is allowing the Airtable team to tell the how do we story as we're progressing across that process. And so what I would like to be able to do in kind of the closing piece here before we open it up for questions is kind of wrap it all up in a bow, hopefully, of saying we take those level 1, 2, 3 insights and wrap them in qualitative storytelling around the how do we framework so that we can then tell the story to our peers and partners internally. And I think the critical piece here being, much like we talked about the Airtable story as a representation of Gainsight customers, if we get a little meta about the presentation, then we recognize the need for you all to do that same process internally. One of the pieces that can be both compelling, interesting, and frankly, deeply frustrating about value stories within community is that it is not a checkbox exercise. It is never done. It is something that is revisited ad infinitum. You are going to go back to that well time and time again. You are going to evolve, refine, and repeat constantly. And I think as we continue to recognize that and wrap our stories up in a way that are more consumable and digestible, all that it does is enable our ability to tell that in a really crisp way. So with that, I will pause and see if we've got any questions that we can address. And maybe I'll nix the share so I can see clearly here.
And I can help facilitate because I have a few questions as always. I've been taking some some notes. So first of all, let me see. Yeah, okay. So have you found a way to show community's impact on more than one department at the same time, like with the same metrics?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that's one where, again, if we are being, whatever the positive version of the word conniving might be, if we are being really clever, there we go. That's the word I'm looking for. If we're being clever, what we search are for those metrics that are multifaceted, where I can go take the same story and kind of spin it just slightly askew, right? To tell a slightly different version of that story. I'll continue to pick on what is clearly my favorite example of that support deflection use case. If I'm talking to support about that departmental impact metric, it's avoidance of cost outright, right? Here is the ability to remove costs from your operations. If I'm talking to product, there is still value in that departmental impact metric of now, instead of cost avoidance, self-service, right? We are increasing the efficiency of the product by helping folks take advantage of that capability set. So I think that's the sort of mindset I find to work really well, is where can I take what I'm measuring and just slightly spin it to be able to tell like the same output in terms of the quantitative impact, but a totally different qualitative outcome derived from it. That's it. There
You're
will always be. I'm sorry, Beth. I cut you off. I apologize.
That's okay. I was gonna say, I don't think conniving is the right word. I think it's creative,
Creative. There
clever.
we
I
go.
think
I
you're
think
on the
it's
right.
keywords. We just got the wrong one. That's it.
And Piper actually asked, so this is a good segue from what you said about support deflection, because she's wondering about like in the weeds.
Yeah.
How did you determine that the cost of opening a support ticket is $25?
That's a really great question. And the answer there is always to partner with your support organization. There's any number of ways that folks can do that. There's a lot of different determinations of that number. Is it fully loaded? Is it how much does it cost kind of in the moment? But ultimately, what organizations are doing is taking what is our investment in terms of technology, tooling, and headcount divided by the number of cases. If I'm being deeply reductive. So what's easy math for me to do? Let's say it's $1 million a year for me and I get 10 tickets, right? It's $100,000 a pop for each of those tickets if that is my budget for that organization. So a bit reductive.
Okay.
Hopefully that helps, Piper, of like, what is my total cost outlay? What's my total output? And I just divide the two by one another.
There you go.
That said, practically, I would highly encourage you, like, go talk to your support team. They know these numbers, right? Don't try and derive it yourself. See if you can get stakeholders that will help get that number for you.
As soon as you said, "What's easy math for me to do?" 1 million. I was like, "Oh, John, we're in different camps."
How many zeros do I cut off, right?
Okay, so then I have a question for you about metrics specifically because it's not a loud debate, but it is a bit of an ongoing debate
Yeah.
in the industry of like engagement metrics and what do you track and what counts, what's important. Obviously, every community is different, but do you think that reaction, like emojis and reactions, are engagement
Yeah, I do.
or
Yeah, I
okay?
do. Like, and so can we carry forward? Someone clicked a like button, therefore there's some discrete monetary impact. That's probably a little more dubious. But to me, the short circuit of like, is this a measure worth knowing? Is did it require someone to volunteer their time, albeit like a microsecond in this case? It did, right? Like someone did still come to an environment, read a thing that they did not just immediately go, that was a waste of my time. Like they did something, right? And so I do believe there to be a latent, not even latent, like an active utility that is being expressed from that. I think the broader question is there a way for us to say we've got 100 likes on this piece of content, therefore we've been able to drive additional adoption of this feature? That's where I think we get to a little bit more dubious, firmly a level 1 metric in my mind.
Right. And I mean, it also talks because we talk about how much we love our lurkers. And even
Absolutely.
though you come in and you don't do anything, that doesn't mean you're not actively engaging in the content and you're not reading everything or observing things or learning. So I think that what you're talking about, they're like, yes, you can track these things and then just keep them on the level so that you don't cloud the picture that you need to be painting for whichever
100%.
team.
I think that's absolutely right. And as we're thinking about ongoing growth of our experiences, where are there dynamics that we need to be in front of? That is a measure for us to be aware of, right? If there's a consistent run rate and then we start to see it dip off or increase, something's up. Like it is a cue, it is a breadcrumb for us to go chase down additional measures.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, John. This has been very, very helpful. It's been a pleasure to have you on our stage today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.
I really appreciate, I mean, I feel so selfish when I get to just sit back here and like watch all of these incredible experts talk about things, but I truly am taking so many notes. Um, yeah, I feel like this is why we put these events on, right? Is so that everybody can learn a new thing or two and implement it into their work.